Two Muslim members of Congress, Ralph Ellison and Andre Carson, spoke at the National Press Club about anti-Muslim prejudice and anti-Muslim rhetoric in politics. NPR correspondent Allison Fitzgerald Kojak moderates this hour-long discussion.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Thomas Burr, the Washington correspondent for the Salt Lake Tribune and the 109th president of the National Press Club. Today we have the two Muslim members of Congress here to talk about the hateful rhetoric aimed at the followers of Islam. And they join a stream of government officials who have spoken in our Newsmaker series. Last week, Congressman David Jolly and Rick Nolan appeared in this room to talk about ending the Dialing for Dollars fundraising efforts. GOP House Policy Chair Representative Luke Messer was here recently to discuss the 2016 race, and House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee Chairman Bill Schuster appeared before us to talk about his FAA bill. And of course, the National Press Club annually has several members of Congress here for Journalists versus Lawmakers Spelling Bee. Gentlemen, I will not ask you to spell anything today, but I do thank you for being here to discuss this very relevant and important topic. I will now hand over the podium to the wonderful Allison Fitzgerald Kojak, the chair of our Board of Governors. Allison.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. As Tommy said, my name's Allison Fitzgerald Kojak. I'm a health policy correspondent at NPR, and I'm chairman of the Board of Governors here at the club. A few weeks ago, right here in Washington, D.C., a woman in a Starbucks coffee shop called a fellow customer who was a Muslim a, quote, worthless piece of Muslim trash. And then she poured a drink on her. And last week, a man pleaded guilty to obstructing a woman's freedom to practice her religion after he ripped her hijab off her on an airplane. These incidents aren't isolated. The latest FBI crime data shows that while hate crimes are down in general, hate crimes against Muslims have increased. And in the political arena, presidential hopeful Donald Trump has called for a ban on allowing Muslims to enter the United States altogether. Here to talk about these issues today, as Tommy said, are the only two Muslim members of Congress. Representative Keith Ellison is a Democrat from Minnesota who was elected in 2006 to represent the people of Minneapolis, and Congressman Andre Carson has represented the 7th District of Indiana since 2008. In addition to the reporters in the room, we have a number of journalists listening on the phone. If any of those listening would like to ask a question, please email them to questions@press.org and identify your news outlet and your name. Gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club. I think we'll start with Congressman Ellison.
Hey, good morning, everybody. And let me thank you, Allison, for moderating. And also let me give appreciation and thanks to my good friend Andre Carson. When I got elected to Congress, I had a few people say, well, this is going to be like a fluke thing. You know, you're going to be elected, but that's going to be it. Well, it wasn't long before Andre joined me, and he is the first Muslim ever to be serve on the House Intelligence Committee, which is a tremendous honor and a great responsibility. And I'm very grateful to him for his friendship and colleagueship. Muslims are part of the American fabric, always have been, and they're going to be. It so happens that anti-Muslim hate spikes with the presidential cycle. It's not just Trump. Before Trump ever said that he was going to ban Muslims from entering the country temporarily, that didn't give me any comfort, did it you? We had Herman Cain and Newt Gingrich saying the same thing 4 years before that. We had Sarah Palin making discriminatory and intolerant comments regarding Muslims before that. So this political cycle that we live in is something that somehow attracts candidates who want to divide Americans on actually any basis that they can in order to achieve electoral success. Let me also say it's not just historical. Even in this particular race, it's certainly not Trump, and I hope that nobody here makes a mistake of thinking, oh, this is about Trump. This is not about Trump. Perhaps one of the scariest developments of this election is when an open, well-known Muslim hater, identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a bigot and a hate monger, a man named Frank Gaffney, was put on as a top aide to Senator Cruz. Also, we know that Dr. Carson, no relation here, Ben Carson said that potential Syrian immigrants were like dogs, and a bunch of other hateful, scary comments. Okay, now what is the fallout from all this? Make no mistake about it, these things have real consequences. And I want to just say, Ellison very correctly pointed out just some of them. But of course, there are many more. I remember when the whole Ground Zero Mosque faux controversy was going on. There was an occasion where a man got into a cab, asked the driver, "Are you a Muslim?" The man responded affirmatively, and the person in the cab began to stab. I can tell you, with a knife, I can tell you that I know literally dozens and dozens of people who feel like they've been pulled off airplanes, they've been held up for hours. It's not just private discrimination, it's actually an official side to this as well. And so what do we do about it? We have to adhere to our core constitutional values. Equal protection under the law, due process of law, fairness, religious tolerance, and inclusion. Congress shall make no law establishing a religion. It's in the First Amendment, the same one that guarantees the right of a place like the National Press Club to exist. So we should adhere to our basic value system. That's what values are. In a time of trouble, in a time where there's confusion and fear, we do the right thing by clutching our core values, and that is what we must do at this time. Let me wrap up my comments and hand it over to Andre, but I want to leave you with this thought. The Muslim community is not taking it lying down. The Muslim community is doing a number of things that I think are very important to note. One, the Muslim community is reaching out on an interfaith basis to people in the Christian community, the Jewish community, the Buddhist community, the Hindu community, and saying, look, we're gonna stick together. And the diverse faith community of this country has responded in a very positive way. I remember one time Terry Jones, the well-known Muslim hater from Florida, went up to Dearborn to try to have a hate rally, and there were probably more Christians and Jews at that rally opposing him than there were Muslims. The second thing the Muslim community is doing is it is voting. The Muslim community is voting and becoming a voting bloc. Today, we do not talk about the Muslim vote as we might talk about the women's vote or the black vote or this vote or that vote. But we will be, and we actually should be now. There are a lot of states where the Muslim vote is the critical vote. Michigan, Virginia, I can tell you in my own district of Minneapolis, most of the Muslim votes are Somali votes, and people kind of talk about the two interchangeably, but this is a very important political bloc in my state of Minnesota. The Somali community is a critical constituency for anyone who wants to hold office to court. And they're 100%, not 100%, but 99% Muslim. If they're not, I don't know any. So the Muslim community is responding, and it's not just responding by voting. It's responding by people running for office. I'm talking to people every day, and Andre will probably, knows many, like people like Rashida Tlaib in Michigan, Akeo Ben Samad, Abdul Samad in Iowa, people running every day, not just for Congress, but for city councils, for local races and things like that. And I believe that this anti-Muslim hate is going to be responded to with a renewed investment in activism. And the people who promoted this kind of hateful behavior are going to wish they had never done it, because they're awakening a group of loyal, dedicated Americans who love their country and appreciate the democracy that we have and are going to rededicate themselves to it. In fact, they're doing so right as we speak. So with that, I'll yield the microphone and await questions.
Thank you, Ellison. Kojak, I love that name since I have his haircut. Thank you. To Tommy Burr and, of course, Jessica and my good friend and colleague, Keith Ellison. I often say that he and I are like Batman and Robin in Congress. He, of course, is Batman, and I'm Robin. I'll take that. it's a special time to have someone to work with like Congressman Ellison. Yes, he's the first Muslim in Congress, and I came shortly after Keith. Folks don't know we're classmates. I came in a special election. But, you know, we live in very serious times. Keith mentioned the Founding Fathers. And the great thing about the Founding Fathers, as complicated as they were, they had a reference point from Europe when they came over here to make it a point to establish in our Constitution that there shall not be a religious test to hold public office. Congress shall not make any law respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And it was so important that they had to outline it in the Constitution. Muslims have been a part of our great country since the inception of our country, and arguably before the inception of our country. You know, I grew up in a predominantly Baptist family. I went to a Catholic school, former altar boy. My conversion came about at a very critical time in my life. I was a teenager. I wrestled with the great tenets of Catholicism and spoke to the priest regularly. And puberty hit, and I realized that probably wouldn't be the best path for me, but I was influenced by their commitment to service. Even more so, the neighborhood that I grew up in, the street that I grew up on, the middle-class street, but surrounding that was a crack-infested area. And I saw Muslims in my own community doing what law enforcement refused to do or was simply incapable of doing. And that was pushing back on criminal enterprises, pushing back on drug activity. This was the height of the crack cocaine era. And I was influenced by that commitment to public service through non-traditional means. And as a young Muslim and as a young teenager, I had many run-ins with law enforcement. Just walking down the street. I was always a tall kid. But there was one time when I was 17 years old and I was actually arrested at a mosque. And the charges were dropped. But that was a defining moment for me. And I didn't know that that situation in 1991 would have me look back as a reference point and see now what we're dealing with as a community. We saw in New York City, unfortunately, where the great New York Police Department had spying on mosques without having met the reasonable suspicion or probable cause test. We've seen instances where police departments' relationships with the Muslim community are in large part frayed. But we've also seen instances where you have an apparatus like the New York Police Department have nearly 1,000 officers who just happen to be Muslim, and many of whom serve in our military. We've seen other instances where there are Muslims in our intelligence services. I come from the intelligence community. I work for the Indiana Department of Homeland Security, working in intelligence and counterterrorism. So it's disappointing to hear folks who are running for the highest office in the land say that they don't want Muslims coming into our country. It's disappointing to hear people who claim to love the United States of America talk about and try to point fingers at how Muslims are the root of all of society's ills. You go back and look at the discrimination against Irish Americans, against Italian Americans, against Jewish brothers and sisters, against Latino Americans. It's continually African Americans, but nonetheless, we as Americans cannot stand for bigotry. Keith's symbolism has great value. When I see Rashida Tlaib, great value. When I see City Councilman Mohammadine in New Jersey, great value. But the nearly 8 million Muslims don't have a political presence in our country. I can remember, and Keith can remember as well, pre-9/11 trying to register Muslims to vote. And there was great pushback. The emphasis was on being an engineer, being a doctor, being a lawyer. And it's true. You go to any major hospital in this country, you'll find a Muslim physician. You go to some courtrooms in this country, you'll find great Muslim barristers, lawyers. But the nearly 8 million Muslims don't have much political leverage. And now, in the post 9/11 reality, the same community that dealt with racial animosities on one end, and you had instances of immigrant brothers and sisters who would not return the greetings of Assalamu alaikum to African Americans, now you're seeing this community question its identity in a very real way. And so, as we are seeing, as evidenced by the Clinton campaign, as evidenced by the Sanders campaign, you're seeing a growing Muslim presence in these campaigns. The question becomes, how can we leverage our voting bloc to influence change? How can we come together through the coalition building, through the interfaith movements that have taken place, through the great works of my friend Rabbi Schneier and Russell Simmons, who have their Center for Global Understanding, and other examples in Indiana, Minnesota, and across the globe, where Muslims are coming together, working for positive change in our society. So I want to thank you. I'm happy to be here. Let's get to it, Allison. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm going to go to questions, and I'm going to ask you when I call on you to please say your name and your affiliation. But I'm going to start with the first question. So we talked a little bit about these experiences that other people have had of Islamophobia, people attacking them because of their religion. Have either of you in recent months had personal experiences like this, and could you share them with them if so?
Well, I think both of us have had
Can you come up to the mic?
I think both of us have had a number of these kind of anti-Muslim hate experiences. I think on the Twitter feed, we probably get them every day. We get them through the mail nearly every day, and it's a pretty common thing. We've had them officially. I remember when I first got to Congress, you know, one of my first experiences was with Congressman Virgil Goode, who told everybody that if America followed the Virgil Goode immigration policy, we'd never have a problem such as a Muslim entering Congress. Only problem is I was born in the United States, so anyway. And we had more, you know, I think when Peter King, you know, used the Homeland Security Committee to only target Muslims, that was anti-Muslim hate and bigotry. So it's official and unofficial and private individuals. I think it's very important. I hope one of the messages that gets through is not just bad individuals acting badly. There is an official component to this, and it must be addressed, and we're not going to stop talking about it. But, you know, more recently, you know, we've gotten threats. One thing is that Andre and I and other Muslims who are engaged in American political life, and even some British Muslims engaged in British political life, have been threatened by Daesh, which I also call anti-Muslim hate, because we don't do it the way they say we should do it. So we're dealing with it on both sides. You know, people who proclaim Islam who are haters and killers like Daesh, and, you know, the Trumps of this world. But it's recent, it's frequent, but we're undaunted.
Okay, and one more. You both seem to feel that you need to speak for the entire Muslim community as the only Muslim representatives in Congress. Are there other members of Congress who are standing up with you strongly, and who might they be?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. My good friend from New York, Joe Crowley. I think Javier Becerra. I think of Maxine Waters. I think of one of my mentors, someone like Emmanuel Cleaver, who is the former mayor of Kansas, but also a Christian pastor. And I think it has a lot more weight coming from a Christian pastor to speak out against Islamophobia than it would me or Keith. But there are scores of members who are very progressive and forward-thinking. Sherry Bustos out of Illinois, my next-door neighbor. Nancy Pelosi, who put me on the Intelligence Committee. I mean, she deserves a lot of credit. It was a very bold move for her. And I think it speaks to the kind of great leader she is. So there are scores of people who are speaking out against Islamophobia.
Can I also mention, just the other day, Andre, Steny Hoyer and I stayed on a little late on a Friday. I didn't jump right on the plane and go back to Minnesota. Where did we go? Steny and I went to a mosque in Maryland, sat down and talked with community members. So this is common, and after some of the hate was really pumping in December, Andre and I and Crowley asked the whole caucus to reach out to the members of the Democratic caucus to reach out to Muslims in their community. And, a lot of people have just come up to me very, informally and talked about how they've done this. Even new members like Congressman, the guy with the auto dealer. Don Beyer has been a leader on this. He's been a leader on this. And so I just want to, mention those as well.
Okay. You had a question?
Thank you. Sam Husseini with IPA Media. You've mentioned Trump and Cruz and Carson. I think all the names that you've mentioned are Republicans who you feel are guilty of some form of Islamophobia. Rania Khalek, an Arab American writer, recently had a piece recounting that in the year 2000, in her 2000 run, Hillary Clinton, after there were allegations that she was taking "quote-unquote" Muslim money, returned the money and refused to meet with members of the Muslim American and Arab American communities. How do you respond to an incident like that? Would you say that the Democratic Party itself is clear of Islamophobic sentiment as well?
I can only speak on. I can only speak on what I know about, and I'm a Bernie supporter, and I support Bernie running all the way through the election. But I have to be honest and tell you that I'm not aware of that, right? Well, I'm not aware of the incident. I tell you what I am aware of. I know that when she came to Minnesota, and this is just being fair and honest, when she came to Minnesota, she specifically reached out to the Muslim community and had a sit down to talk about anti-Muslim hate. I know about that. I also know that years ago when she was Secretary of State, Black Caucus had a meeting with her, and she had recently appointed a special envoy to Muslim communities, Farah Pandit. And she sat Andre and I right next to Farah because she wanted to make sure we were talking and comparing notes. Now, I don't want to say something didn't happen when I don't know that it did, and when I don't have any information. But I can say that if that did happen, that there's weight with her reaching out as well. Again, I'm not trying to discount anyone's experience. I don't have any information on it, but I can tell you she did some things and has not in any way contributed to anti-Muslim hate. In fact, Huma Abedin is one of her closest aides, and Huma's been the target of a lot of anti-Muslim hate herself, and I've never sensed that Secretary Clinton is backing away from her association with Huma Abedin. So, again, I'm a Bernie guy. I'm standing up here. If you want to talk who I think should be president, I believe it's Bernie Sanders. But fair is fair, true is true, and she has no record that I'm aware of anti-Muslim hate.
As a Clinton guy.
Did I mention that?
As Keith stated, one of her chief advisors and closest confidants is Huma Abedin, who is phenomenal. She's a friend of mine. Secretary Clinton was in Indianapolis a few weeks ago. We helped to ensure that Muslims were not only there, they were part of the process, and there were a group of Syrian Americans who had a moment with Secretary Clinton. I mean, if you look at her history, as not only First Lady of Arkansas, but First Lady of the United States of America, and even Secretary of State. She is the most traveled Secretary of State in U.S. history. Let's make that clear. Whenever I go to embassies who happen to have Muslim ambassadors, they talk about the bridge building that was done under her leadership as Secretary of State. When I go to Muslim communities across the country, and the community is divided. Some are feeling the burn, and some, like me, we're climbing up that hill. But they respect Secretary Clinton because she has a kind of special sensitivity as it relates to issues impacting the Muslim community, as it relates to unwarranted surveillance, as it relates to outright discrimination. And I believe, and we can talk about this later, that once she becomes president, you will see Muslims in very important positions in her cabinet.
Did you have a question?
Yes.
Go.
My name is Gregorio Meraz. I'm a reporter for Televises Network from Mexico. Do you believe that in the effort of getting more votes, Mr. Trump is appealing the most radical and supremacist sectors in the U.S. that usually did not vote, but now they are even offering financial help?
The leadership.
Well, may I say, first of all, that it's important to point out that there's a lot of Muslims in America of Latin American origin. In fact, it's one of the fastest growing parts of the American Muslim community. But let me also say, too, that before he ever said ban the Muslims, he said Mexicans are rapists and drugs dealers. And so you're right, it's kind of an equal opportunity discriminator. I'm going to tell you this. I think it is incomplete to just say he's appealing to people's bigotry. It's incomplete. What he's really doing is appealing to people's tribalism. And he's defining the tribe as white working class people. And he's saying, if you're in that group, you're us. And if you're not, you're out. And so he's doing two things at once when he starts spewing hate at Mexicans, people with disabilities, women. It's very important to talk about his just unbridled misogyny. But it's a tribalistic, paternalistic impulse, you know, to try to get some people to say, yeah, he's for me, and simultaneously make other people think he's not for me, but that is what he's trying to do. He is trying to he's basically making a tribalistic case that he thinks is going to bounce in his favor. But I got a feeling that as he tries to draw in people who feel alienated and are attracted by his message, he is simultaneously activating whole groups of Americans of all colors who reject that sort of nastiness. Andre?
Yeah, I think what's curious about Mr. Trump, and I know my people who love me get nervous when I say this, but you know, I've read most of Mr. Trump's books. I've met Mr. Trump. Yeah, his personal persona betrays his rhetoric, which concerns me. So I think the kind of Machiavellian maneuvering that we're seeing, and to Keith's point, he is speaking to a segment of our population that is disillusioned with their government. They feel disenfranchised. They feel like they're getting a smaller piece of the American pie, as it were. So when you're talking about making America great again, that is a form of meta messaging to a certain segment. We're talking about white brothers and sisters, largely blue collar. And for him to, as someone who has had Muslim employees, as someone who has done business in Muslim countries, Islamic countries, you would think that the kind of sophistication that it would take as an executive to make those maneuvers, to then spew very third grade, junior high style antics and rhetoric to gin up these crowds that generate a lot of media attention, respectfully, it concerns me. It tells me that here's a guy who's a great showman, who's a P.T. Barnum, but who will not stop at anything in order to garner attention to leverage it to his favor. That kind of impulsivity concerns me as it relates to someone who would be commander-in-chief. That kind of inclination, I think that Mr. Trump is a classic bully. So he has a very high emotional intelligence. When you see him on stage with Marco Rubio, he's saying little Marco. He can assess a person very quickly, like most bullies, and know what to say and do to get underneath their skin. And that kind of impulsivity, when you're dealing with the complexities of foreign affairs, concerns me when you have a country that may disagree with our policy on a particular position, and to then outright use our military as leverage to exact revenge for a philosophical disagreement should be a concern to most Americans if they get beyond the rhetoric and the emotionalism that comes with Mr. Trump.
The gentleman at the door.
While we are talking about Mr. Trump and his speech against Muslims and other Muslims, there is a wide range of Muslims who support him. 2 days ago, there was a new association that Muslims for Trump from New Jersey, from New York. How do you see that?
I wouldn't say the support is wide-ranging. I mean, Mr. Trump said recently, oh, the Mexicans, they love me. And I think he was referring to like 5 who voted for him in Arizona. So I think the support is greatly overstated. Listen, after 9/11, there were Muslims who supported President Bush. And there were Muslims, most Muslims did not necessarily support President Bush. I think you will always find in any community that has been subjugated to racism, Islamophobia, and outright bigotry, there will always be some who feel it is important to go beyond the call of duty to placate to those who are calling for greater discrimination against them. So I can't speak as to why these folks are supporting Mr. Trump. They have that right to support Mr. Trump. But I would caution them in their strategy against conceding any kind of dignity to win favor with a bully. As anyone who has dealt with a bully knows that once you give up your lunch money, it will not stop. And I think that and Keith and I are in New Jersey and New York all the time with Muslims who do not support Mr. Trump, with Muslims who are very critical of Mr. Trump, with Muslims who have articulated an agenda, a progressive agenda that speaks to the sentiment that is growing in our country. So I think that's a small section. I'm not familiar with their background. In fact, some of the Muslims that I know who have worked for Mr. Trump are from Newark, New Jersey and New York, but I don't have a background on the group.
I guarantee you, if you, that if you were to see if there were any African Americans who supported George Wallace, you'd probably find a few.
That's true.
And so it's not unusual that you see a few people who who believe in that. But in my opinion, it's just I don't know. Muslims who support Trump is like, chickens for Colonel Sanders. You know what I mean? It's, you think that you're going to be the chicken who doesn't get fried up?
Yeah.
Well, I think you better guess again.
That's right.
I think we have a question from the phone.
Yeah, I got a question that was emailed earlier today. My name is David Hose. I'm a deputy chair of the Newsmaker committee. This comes from Susie Rosenbluth of the Jewish Voice and Opinion. And her question to you is, terrorism and other threats from a relatively small percentage of Muslims worldwide has led to the anti-Muslim sentiment that is affecting the Muslim community as a whole. Is it possible the primarily Muslim-led anti-Israel and virtually Judeo-phobic anti-Semitic discourse ubiquitous on college university campuses throughout the world has in effect legitimized the very Islamophobic rhetoric that you're talking about today?
There's a lot packed in there, a number of assumptions in there. I will say this, that American Muslims and American Jews have a lot in common. We're both minority religions. There's a lot of interfaith cooperation, happens all the time. And I think it's only going to grow. I think the truth is that on the issue of Israel-Palestine peace, that there's a lot of approaches. I happen to support a two-state solution. But, this is an issue that cries out for public attention, and people do want to focus their attention on what might be done to resolve that conflict. And they're taking different kinds of approaches. And some of them might be more constructive than others, right? So I'll simply say that I would not say that it's anti-Muslim hate is somehow connected to Muslims raising questions around the current Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I don't think one's driving the other. There is Muslim anti-Semitism. There's Jewish racism. There's every kind of people can be as hateful as any other kind of people. Nobody has a monopoly on bigotry and intolerance. But I will also add that simply questioning, Israeli policy in connection with the Palestinians is not inherently anti-Jewish. There are legitimate, complaints people can make, and they should make them based on facts, based on good faith. They should never only single Israel out for violations, because there's a whole lot of violations of human rights going on across this globe. But they shouldn't. But at the same time, if there are Israeli human rights violations against Palestinians, I don't think it's right to ignore them. And I certainly don't think it's anti-Semitism to ignore fact-based situation when it occurs. So that's all I have to say about it.
Yeah, to that point, we had a young lady at Indiana University in Indianapolis who was threatened for being vocal in terms of the expansion of settlements in Israel. Took a trip recently with the Congressional Black Caucus, and we pushed the issue with the Israeli government about a two-state solution, which I support. But we also raised deeper concerns about the mistreatment of Ethiopians as well. And I have found that Jewish Americans in particular are on the same page as it relates to a two-state solution, as it relates to Ethiopians not being discriminated against, or other Africans who have an identification toward Israel, but once they get there, they feel like they're treated less than. And so I think as human beings, we have to get away from the inclination to deify one particular group and realize that we all are a part of one human creation. We may attach different mythologies to our identification to make ourselves feel better about who we are. But at the end of the day, if we see ourselves equally as human beings, then we can begin to unearth truths that will solve some of our situations and concerns globally.
Okay, I may be wrong, but I thought I also heard a little bit in that question about the issue of fear of terrorism and combining, and I know these are touchy issues, but how do you separate the identity of the terrorist from the identity of the Muslim? You must have to deal with that on a regular basis.
Yeah, we do have to contend with that problem. People, whenever we hear of a horrific, tragic incident, the first impulse is to the welfare of the victims of that horrible incident. The second question is, if a Muslim did it, it's going to be rough around here for a while. And that's just reality. But here's the facts. People have studied domestic terrorism and terrorism around the world. If you look at terrorism in the United States, anti-government white supremacist groups are far more likely to commit acts of terrorism than anyone who proclaims to be Muslim. But at the same time, Andre and I are first in line to say that if somebody commits an act of terrorism and they say they do it because of Islam, prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. They have absolutely no quarter with the Muslim community. And they have no quarter with the Muslim community. And let me just also say this, as people sort of think, well, there's Muslims who commit acts of terrorism, therefore all of you people are suspect. Imagine this, when the Ku Klux Klan inspires Dylan Roof to kill 9 people in a church in Charleston, we don't assume that all white males have to apologize or explain themselves about it. No one comes up to white males and says, hey, look, man, do you condone this? We assume they reject that horrific behavior. And that's all people in the Muslim community want, is to say, look, I'm a person, and of course we are absolutely against Daesh. They're threatening to kill us if people don't know. So the thing is that this is an important question that we do contend with a lot. Now, I'll just wrap up with this. Whenever you hear about people, refugees fleeing Raqqa and Iraq, or you hear about bombings in Iraq, or you hear about these kind of things, who do you think they're killing? They're killing Muslims. Most of the blood on the hands of Daesh and Al-Qaeda and these maniacs are people who are Muslim. There's no love for these people. Or Al-Shabaab. When Al-Shabaab kills people in Somalia, who are they killing? Do you think Boko Haram cares about the religion of the people who were there blowing up, or the girls that they're stealing and raping? No, these are homicidal maniacs who quest one thing, power. That is what they want, and they need a legitimacy. So in the United States, where Islam's a minority religion, you may not sense this, but in places where Islam is a majority religion, and to Muslims who live in America, Islam's a good thing. So why wouldn't these murderers sort of try to cover themselves with it and use it to legitimate their evil. Just like the Klan says we're Christians, or just like Timothy McVeigh says he's a freedom fighter. This is simply exploiting a philosophy beloved by literally over 1 billion people in order to legitimate their wickedness. That's my take on the problem.
Hi, Abigail House-Lerner from the Washington Post. On the statistics that you've been able to look at, maybe from law enforcement, have you been able to identify that there has been a spike in anti-Muslim attacks, verbal and physical, this year as compared to last? And also, have you been able to see a correlation, or are law enforcement officials who you're talking to seeing a correlation between those attacks and the actual rhetoric that you were talking about?
Oh, sure. The Islamic Society of North America is headquartered at the edge of my district. And there was an act of vandalism very recently there. There have been Muslims, as I said, a young lady who was threatened on Indiana University in Indianapolis's campus, a young lady Hadil. And I think that we are seeing these kinds of instances, but what is most troubling is that you have people like Mr. Trump fanning the flames of Islamophobia. So I caution Muslims against retreating in these kinds of times. I caution any other group who has been involved in important interfaith efforts. You have a Catholic group who has done work with Imam W.D. Muhammad's community, the Focolari. You have Jewish brothers and sisters with the JCRCs in places like New York, Indianapolis, and across the country who are standing up boldly and who are going to mosques, participating in Jumu'ah prayer services, saying we will not let our fellow citizens be victim of this kind of bigotry. So there has been an increase since 2015, but the increase is important in these times, and it's important for our friends in the media not to overlook the spike in numbers, but to highlight these issues, to hold our candidates accountable when they make these kinds of inflammatory remarks.
Okay, we only have time for one or two more questions, so I'll call on you.
Yeah, Sam Brody, Min Post. I wanted to ask, when terrorist attacks occur that are perpetrated by Muslims, people often call on Muslims in power to respond, to condemn it. I'm curious what your calculus is like in deciding when to respond, if to respond, and if you face pressure from your colleagues or leaders in your party to publicly respond to those attacks.
Well, as I already mentioned, I think that when any horrific attack happens, any terrorist attack or even a natural disaster, it is incumbent upon all decent people to publicly proclaim sympathy for the victims, particularly if you're in a leadership role like Andre and I are. When a Muslim has committed an act of terrorism, or somebody proclaiming to be Muslim or in the name of Islam, I do feel that unless we're going to ask people to denounce acts of terrorism whenever someone in their demographic group does an act of terrorism, then I think it's not really fair to say that there's a special responsibility for Muslims. But guess what? We do it anyway. Why? Because we need to. We're trying to fight this mistaken notion that Muslims condone these homicidal maniacs' behavior. We do not, and we're clear that we don't. But I can tell you this, for everyone who says you don't hear Muslims condemning, I can give you sheets, buckets, and websites and everything else. People condemn it. The truth is that it's not actually particularly newsworthy when a Muslim condemns terrorism, right? The news the media knows that we do it. It's not, people aren't rushing to that press conference. And that's just the fact of the matter. So the bad side of that is that a lot of people who, don't know what's going on might be under the mistaken impression that Muslims are not condemning terrorism, but Muslims condemn terrorism all the time. We're the number one victims of Daesh's terrorism and Al-Qaeda's too, and Boko Haram's and Al-Shabaab's, and so we do it. But I mean, the truth is, it's not with a certain amount of sense that this has to apply to everybody or it shouldn't apply to anybody.
No, I think oftentimes we get those requests, and I don't see myself as the spokesperson for all Muslims. I'm just a regular guy from Indiana who represents the 7th Congressional District who happens to be Muslim, but I proudly speak on these issues, largely because I think I have a different lens, and that is a law enforcement lens, starting with the Sheriff's Department, Marion County as a special deputy, then State Excise Police, then Department of Homeland Security, now the Intelligence Committee, but also as someone who has been on the other side and had been pushed on a police car, who was arrested at 17 without justification as an African American. So my lens is different as a black man and as a Muslim, where you have, and a big guy, so you have triple the suspicion, triple the assumption, but it's an opportunity to talk about these issues and hopefully educate people on the importance of law enforcement and the sacrifices that our law enforcement officers make each and every day. It is a thankless job, literally. But at the same time, there are elements in law enforcement and things that start and begin at the police academy that need to be corrected as it relates to recruitment efforts and as it relates to practices that oftentimes solidify sexist views, racist views, Islamophobic views, anti-Jewish views, and so on and so forth. So I see it as an opportunity to speak to these issues, and if I have a chance as a member of Congress to talk about a transportation bill that I introduced, I'll do it as well, but I'll still speak boldly about the other issues.
With Al Arabiya. My question is, what you're talking about with rhetoric, I mean, what's the solution to it? Is there a specific legal solution? For example, I know that there's a couple of bills that are circulating, one regarding prohibiting using religion to ban Muslims, for example, ban people from coming to the United States. There's another one about criteria used to kick people off of airplanes. I mean, is there a legal solution to this, or is this just encouraging people to basically have better rhetoric?
Well, first of all, there is a whole range of solutions. It all depends on what the particular nature of the problem is. So, yes, in some cases there are appropriate legislative solutions we are pushing revolving around the issue of not profiling people based strictly on their religion. You have to do behavior, not just identity. That's one. The other thing, but at the end of the day, Mona, this is something that Americans of all faiths, including Muslims, have to stand up and work on. And this is going to be solved when that mosque and that synagogue and the members in it sit down in that local community in Indianapolis or Minneapolis and talk about their shared humanity, their shared citizenship as Americans. When that mosque and that Christian community come together, that is the root of it, because the community is going to solve this problem. We are going to offer legislation. There will be legal challenges, legislative challenges versus going to court. But let me just end with a quick little story. This is how you're going to solve it. When Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, only 12% of the people of Ferguson were voting. And so when the next election came up, I went down there, and a few members of the Black Caucus went down there to try to increase voter turnout. And so one of the things I did is I went into an African-American Baptist church. And in that church, I found Salam Clinic. So now you got a black preacher and 3 Muslim Pakistani doctors. Maybe one of them was Egyptian and American, the other 2 were Pakistani, but some doctors. And they're taking their Saturday to see patients all day long for free. Here's the kicker. I say, hey, pastor, doctors, thank you guys for doing this. This is very important. And it's great that in response to the, to the civil disturbances in the wake of the Mike Brown shooting, that you guys set this clinic up. They said, man, we've been doing this for years. 3-4 years we've been doing this, and we're about to start another one in St. Louis. So now these people have a different faith tradition, Muslim, Christian. They're different racial backgrounds. One is Asian, the other one's African American. And yet, all that superficial stuff didn't matter because they knew that they both had a mission, and that is to meet the health needs of the poor people of Ferguson. And they were doing it together. This is how we will solve this problem, because from there, people will come up with ideas about how to do counter messaging. They will come up with ideas about how to sue when the government is abusing people's civil rights, which is a very important part of this anti-Muslim hate conversation. And they will be able to talk about holding people like Trump to account because they will invigorate an electorate, and there will be a powerful voting bloc, which if you start spewing hate, you'll have to run into trouble. Andre and I are African Americans. Do y'all remember when Don Imus was running around talking about nappy-headed hoes? He lost his job. I'm telling you today, it's not a good idea to say something overtly racist against black people today, because African American institutions will get after you, and you will lose your job for that. But for the Muslim community, you can still kind of say what you want, any kind of mean, nasty, horrible thing. And so the Muslim community has to build up its political cachet. How do you do it? Make friends, build friends, get out of the mosque and connect with people who you have relationships with. How else? Vote. How else? Run for office. How else? Get media savvy, get out a narrative. Anyway, Andre, I'm sure has some.
No, that's add on to Keith's very eloquent point. A point was made earlier about colleagues. I have found, I think most of the trips that I've probably taken, most of them, I've been the only Democrat, in some cases, only African American, with folks who identify with the Tea Party. And I've said some very inflammatory things against the Tea Party. But, through those trips, you start talking to folks and you realize that your differences aren't that great. Democrats and Republicans in most cases are kind of playing within the 10-yard line on a lot of things. And you realize, you agree, you want better schools. You agree, we need to talk about critical capital infusions in certain places like Minneapolis and Indianapolis and New York to create jobs. And our methodologies may vary, but there are some large similarities. I think that there are legal remedies, but you can't legislate human nature. And so we have to speak to the better part of human nature. I mean, the Constitution, it's a great document, but it's a flawed document. I mean, the same Constitution identified African Americans as being subhuman, 3/5 of human beings. So we had to go back, and we had to have Frederick Douglass work with Elizabeth Stanton and others for women's suffrage and women's rights, and work with white brothers and sisters in the abolitionist movement to speak to our better nature, to get Lincoln to emancipate the slaves ultimately. We had to do the same when it came toward desegregating the military, when it came to pushing Johnson on the civil rights question and the voting rights question. And I think to Keith's point, the more Muslims who participate in the political process, it presents a different face for us. The more, as our mutual friend, Dr. Sherman Jackson talks about in his writings, I think that there's a shift taking place, not in the African American Muslim community, because even with African American Muslims, Christians, African American Jews, and others, there's still a common struggle. But in the greater Muslim community, you have Muslims who were legally white in terms of checking a box, but socially non-white, and now they're making a transition because of this newfound status. And that's where the struggle begins. But there is an opportunity there for education on both sides of the aisle. And, I've talked to some of my Republican colleagues who happen to have a Muslim physician or a dentist. And even though that physician or dentist may not be super religious, they still identify as being Muslim, and they still have complaints about paying for their child's education. They still have complaints about their son who won't take out the trash. And just identifying with those common struggles can begin a greater dialogue about our common humanity.
And I also have a son who won't take out the trash. So we're out of time. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Congressman Ellison and Congressman Carson. It was delightful to have you. Thank you.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day.